evolution, which is about as well established as gravity, that was God's mechanism of creation. It makes science an opportunity to glimpse God's mind. It makes the laboratory sometimes feel a little bit like a cathedral.
I think there's a tension. The more religious you are, the more likely you are to oppose science. The Bible has a creation story that is just not right.
I thought that was going to be a problem for me when I started my journey from atheism into what might be faith. But if God is the author of those natural laws, then why could God not decide to suspend those laws for a particular message that needed to be sent?
Can God suspend the laws of nature if he existed? Sure, I don't have a problem with that. Why would he suspend the laws there, but not, I think, in more important cases? Right now, we have these incredible crises like climate change. We have a potential mass extinction event. I'd love to hear your opinion on this, because there's another solution.
Hello and welcome to Unbelievable, the show that aims to get Christians and non-Christians talking about the topics that matter to all of us. I'm Ruth Jackson, and this week we are talking about science, faith, truth and everything in between. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Francis Collins and Phil Halper. Dr. Francis Collins is the former director of the National Institutes of Health, where he served under 3 presidents. He is a physician geneticist noted for his landmark discoveries of disease genes and his leadership of the incredible Human Genome Project. Francis has written numerous books, including the best-selling The Language of God and his most recent book, The Road to Wisdom. He also founded BioLogos, which exists to equip the church and engage the world, demonstrating that faith and science can work hand in hand. Under Francis's leadership, the NIH, with many other partnerships, approved and rolled out 2 COVID-19 vaccines in just 11 months. And he continues to serve today in the White House as a special projects advisor. Phil Halper is a YouTuber who's interviewed many of the world's leading scientists, including Stephen Hawking, Roger Penrose and Alan Guth. He is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and was appointed journalist in residence at the Penn State Institute for Gravitation and the Cosmos. Phil has been lead author on several papers in peer-reviewed journals on topics ranging from cosmology to neuroscience and philosophy. And this is very exciting that in the spring of 2025, his first book will be released. It's called Battle of the Big Bang, The New Tales of Our Cosmic Origins, and it's co-authored with award-winning cosmologist Niayesh Afshordi, and it's published by the University of Chicago Press. Francis and Phil, welcome along. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, glad to be with you.
Yes, great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Well, I know for neither of you is it your first time on Unbelievable, and I know you've shared your stories at different points on the show, but before we dive into the many, many things I want to talk about today, would you mind just briefly summarising your worldview and, again, just whistle-stop tour of how you came to hold that position? So, Francis, if we start with you, you've not always been a Christian, have you?
Oh, no. No, I did not grow up in a home where faith was considered relevant. I got interested in science in high school, particularly in physics and chemistry and mathematics. Went off ultimately to get a PhD in quantum mechanics. And I had no use for people who wanted to talk about anything outside of what science could measure. I was worshiping at the altar of scientism. But then I went to medical school, and sitting at the bedside of people who were dying, wondered how I would handle that and realized I wasn't at all sure. And got challenged by a patient to tell her what I believed, and realized I didn't really know what the answer was. And so over a couple of years of a struggle, which started out trying to strengthen my atheism, didn't quite turn out that way, and ultimately traveled through agnosticism to deism to theism to Christianity. And I'm a follower of Jesus and have been so since age 27.
Brilliant. That was very succinct. Thank you so much. Now, Phil, again, I know you've shared a bit of your background on a recent show, but could you give us a bit of a whistle-stop tour of how you arrived at your current belief system?
Sure. Actually, before I do that, can I just say what an honour it is, one, to be on Unbelievable yet again, but also with Francis Collins, who is a scientific hero. And we are so grateful for everything you did at NIH and everything else, getting the vaccines out, all your other work. It is such an honour. But to answer your question, I was brought up Jewish. I went to Hebrew school and I believed it. I was quite, strong in my belief. And eventually, though, I turned against my faith. It wasn't really a scientific reason. It was more of a moral one. I felt that the Exodus story was basically immoral, that basically targeting the Egyptian firstborn for death is not okay. I thought this is a crime and we're not the good guys here. So that's actually what turned me against my faith, and I've been an atheist ever since.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing so openly and honestly about that. Now, Francis, you've written about the relationship of God and science in both the language of God and the road to wisdom. But I imagine it's still a question that you get asked a lot around whether science and religion can be reconciled or whether they're two fundamentally conflicting positions. Would you mind just sharing your thoughts on that?
Sure. No, when I was 22, I would have said it's irreconcilable. It's not even worth talking about. Science has a certain set of principles. Faith can't live with those, so we better just not try to put them together. Or maybe Stephen Jay Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria, where you keep them carefully separate, would be an acceptable alternative. But that is not the way it turned out for me at all. So having become a Christian at age 27, I will say a lot of my friends hearing about this said, this is going to be short-lived. Your head will explode when you begin to realize that you can't possibly reconcile what you're doing as a scientist, studying genetics, that was my thing, with what the Bible says about origins. And I've never found that to be a problem. I'm glad that I was not raised in a circumstance that required the first couple chapters of Genesis to be read as science books with literal descriptions, which clearly from a reasonable perspective is not the way those chapters were read by the original readers. And I think one can put that together quite comfortably, that evolution, which is about as well established as gravity, is in fact the way in which lives like ours ultimately became possible. That was God's mechanism of creation, and that was put in place at the very origin of the whole show and allowed to play out over billions of years, which for us seems like a long time, but for God is maybe a blink of an eye, since God's not limited by time and space. And what an elegant, amazing way to do it, which also meant that God could put in place natural laws so that matter and energy would behave in orderly fashion that we as scientists could study and learn from. I like the Francis Bacon analogy that God gave us two books: the book of God's words, which is the Bible, and the book of God's works, which is nature. And as a scientist, I get to read both of those books. And it's really exciting to be able to put them together, not in a non-overlapping way, but in a way that I find really harmonious, complementary. It makes science also an opportunity to glimpse God's mind. It makes the laboratory sometimes feel a little bit like a cathedral, because that's what we're about here. We're in awe. We're even worshiping by doing science. Those sound like dramatic statements, but that's how it feels to me as somebody who's been able to put those worldviews together in a single Thursday. And I love it that is possible. And sure, there are times where it seems like, well, that doesn't quite fit with that. And those are good things to discuss. And the whole BioLogos community, which you mentioned in the introduction, which now involves more than 1 million people who are regularly visiting that website or coming to the meetings or using the materials, are engaged in wonderful ways, but always in gracious dialogue, listening to perspectives, often saying, there's not a single answer to this. Let's consider what possible answers there might be. And I find that also to be pretty exhilarating, to be part of those conversations and to have a whole community of people who are both really serious about their Christianity, but really serious about their science.
Well, we'll definitely dive into some of those more difficult bits that you mentioned there, Francis. But Phil, I suppose in many ways, Francis is proof that you can be a Christian and a scientist. But I just want to quote a little bit. I hosted a debate with some wonderful scientists, one of whom was the chemist Peter Atkins, who's obviously quite outspoken about his atheism. And he, in this debate, in front of a Christian who's a scientist, called Christians who have any sort of religious belief stupid. And I quote, he said, "They are not able to distinguish fact and evidence from wishful thinking." So I just wondered, in your opinion, Phil, I feel like you probably wouldn't be quite as strong as Peter Atkins, but do you think that it is a somewhat illogical position to hold Christianity and to be a scientist at the same time?
Well, first off, let me say I totally disagree with Peter Atkins, and I think he doesn't speak for a lot of atheists. We don't think other Christians are stupid. We disagree, of course, but that's okay. So I think there's a tension, let's put it that way. So people have often asked, is there a fundamental conflict between science and religion? I would say, well, it depends on which religion, firstly. I think there's a tension between science and religion. And I would say there is a conflict, but I would call it a probabilistic conflict, in that the more religious you are, and particularly with Christianity and evangelical Christianity in particular, the more likely you are to oppose science and to reject its conclusions. But it's not inevitable. So the fact that there's people like Francis Collins is not evidence against that conflict hypothesis, because it's just saying probabilistically. So take, for example, climate change. There was a survey, something like 90% of atheists accepted the science of climate change, whereas for Christians, it was about 45%. And for evangelicals, it was more like 30 something percent. Same with evolution. About 90% of atheists accept evolution. Evangelical Christians, one survey had 11% for evangelicals. So now there's still 11%. That's 11% of however many Christians there are in America is a lot of people. So it's not inevitable, but it's, I think here's the thing. The Bible has a creation story that is just not right. Now, you can take Francis' position, and I think it's great that some people do, and say, okay, it's a metaphor, or, we shouldn't take it literally. But given there are other passages in the Bible that say, all scripture is God breathed, that's in the Bible, it's not exactly surprising that people don't take Francis's view. And that's where the conflict lies, I think.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Now, Francis, I want to give you a chance to come back at some of the things that Phil was saying there. But you mentioned there the kind of difficult things. And obviously, reconciling the Bible might be difficult for some people with an evolutionary approach. But I guess the other thing is how do we reconcile some of the more unscientific, I guess Peter Atkins, the chemist, would call it superstitious elements of our faith, such as miracles. And given that we're fast approaching Christmas, perhaps we could take, for example, the virgin birth. I mean, how would a scientist who's also a Christian approach the story of the virgin birth?
So, let's go there. And I guess we should also, if we're talking about really important miracles, talk about the resurrection.
Absolutely.
So I thought that was going to be a problem for me when I started my journey from atheism into what might be faith or might be just strengthening atheism. But you know what? It didn't turn out to be, because ultimately I had to decide whether I believed in a God who was the creator of the universe, who made something out of nothing, and who therefore was the author of all the natural laws that govern how the universe behaves. All those wonderful equations that I had so admired as a graduate student in quantum mechanics, they just reflect this phenomenal intelligence, this mind that had the ability to put these things all in place just by thinking them. But if God is the author of those natural laws, and if at one of those great ganglions of history, a phrase from C.S. Lewis, needed to send a message to people that God actually intended to be part of the story in a way that would result in relationship between those creatures, us and God, then why could God not decide to suspend those laws for a particular message that needed to be sent? And if the most significant message that God intended to send was Jesus arriving as both God and man on this planet, then how would that come about? The virgin birth seems like a pretty astounding model to have tapped into. We could have an interesting but not very productive conversation about what would that say about Jesus' DNA. I don't know that I want to really go down that road, although I have occasionally done so. But the idea here, which I believe, based upon the biblical description in the New Testament and lots of other sources, is that this was not a myth, that Jesus was a real person. Even skeptical historians will agree with that, that he really did walk the earth, and he really was crucified. Most historians will agree about that. But where the trouble seems to arise is that he arose from the dead, that the tomb was empty. But read that 738-page tome of Tom Wright entitled The Resurrection of the Son of God, and you will see collected there all of the possible evidence for and against the idea that resurrection was real. And it comes down pretty strongly in the direction of yes. I find that pretty compelling. And again, I am not intrinsically troubled about the fact that this violates everything that I know as a scientist. And when people are dead, they're dead. In this instance, there was a reason for those laws to be broken by the author of the laws. And I believe that's what happened.
So, Phil, would you agree? I mean, presumably you wouldn't agree with lots of what Francis was saying there, but would you agree with the notion that supernatural events are pretty much always impossible from a scientific perspective?
Well, I think it could be possible to probe the supernatural if it existed. There have been suggestions, for example, you could do, let's imagine that all of Catholic prayers were always answered and, no other religion. That could be evidence of the supernatural. I think it's possible. I mean, you would have problems with control groups and, it would be difficult, right? But I don't think it's necessarily impossible. So I don't rule out the supernatural a priori. I just don't think the evidence for it has been very good. So I think, and generally you would want pretty strong evidence for something like that. And I think for events that happened 2,000 years ago, it would be difficult to get very strong evidence for it. So now, can God suspend the laws of nature if he existed? Sure, I guess he could. So I don't have a problem with that. The question is, why would he suspend the laws there, but not, I think, in more important cases? So, for example, if we look at the Gospels, Jesus, for example, in the story of Legion, he expels some demons into 2,000 pigs who then run down a cliff and they all drown. So that was a supernatural intervention. But right now, we have these incredible crises like climate change. We have a potential mass extinction event happening. I would have thought it'd be more important, to intervene now than expelling a demon, or demons. That just seems trivial compared to the sorts of problems that we face. Like literally wiping out most of the life on this planet is what's happening. But yet we see no miracle intervention. So more likely, in my opinion, the miracle interventions just don't happen. That seems more reasonable to me.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't sort of thought about that in terms of the climate change circumstance. But it does seem to me that when God gave humans free will, which I hope we will all agree, we really do have free will, even though God may be aware of what we're going to decide, since God is not limited in time or space, then we were given the chance to use that for good or for evil. In the case of climate change, the problems that we see are almost in great confidence in stating this because of human activity. And we have failed to recognize the need for change to prevent that from getting worse. So that's kind of on us. And to expect God to clean up after us when we've made a free will decision to harm our own home, we are not taking care of creation. Seems like that lets us off the hook. This one's on us. We should be the ones, not necessarily to engineer a miracle, but to engineer a solution.
No, but may I just reply to that?
Of course.
It may be on us, but let's not forget, it's not just climate change. We see a mass extinction event happening that's actually independent of climate change. It's, we're invading the natural habitats of animals. And so they are suffering for it. So it's not really fair to say, well, human free will allow that. No, we're wiping out all the other species on the planet. Also, and there could be simple solutions. Like, for example, imagine God just decreed that maybe we shouldn't eat meat so much, or maybe he made us vegetarians. Now, you can't really say that God wouldn't do that because he actually, Brian brought up Jewish, he has laws about what we should eat. He's told us, at least for the Jews, you can't mix milk and meat. You can't eat pigs. So imagine that he said you can't eat meat. That would actually alleviate a lot of huge problems that we have. So I don't think that the free will defense really works there.
I guess I hear what you're saying. It does seem, however, that There's got to be some limit to the way in which God will intervene with the natural laws that God created. Otherwise, everything falls into chaos. And that's not necessarily a world we want to be part of either. So it seems like God has to be really selective about suspending those laws. And maybe you and I would choose different interventions. I mean, God didn't choose to deflect that asteroid that crashed into the Earth 62 or 63 million years ago. Talk about extinction of species. Oh my gosh. And yet, without that, probably the evolution of large-brained primates that would actually have a conversation like this about God might not have happened, or maybe it would have been large-brained rodents.
Well, I think the issue of animal suffering is huge, isn't it? And maybe we could invite you both back to have a discussion about that, because it's so fascinating and really, really important.
Yes.
But Francis, I suppose it's one thing to say that science and religion are not conflicting positions, but I know you've said in The Road to Wisdom and elsewhere that science itself actually provides pointers towards a creator. I mean, we've not got loads of time to go into this, but what are some of those pointers in your opinion?
So, and Phil is more of an expert on some of these than I am. There is the argument about the Big Bang, the cosmological argument that the universe appears to have had a beginning. So things that have a beginning, according to the Kalam version of this, require a cause. The cause cannot itself require a cause, or you created an infinite regress. So the cause must be uncaused, which sounds, in many people's perspective, like a creator God, at least a deist kind of God. And then when you look at the nature of the universe, again, these beautiful equations that govern the behavior of the whole thing. I mean, look at Maxwell's equations. I mean, just exquisitely beautiful, simple. You knew they were right because they were so perfect. Why should that be? And then when you look at the constants that actually can't be derived by theory, they just are what they are, and you can measure them experimentally. No matter how you tweak it, you still come down to an extreme improbability that we would have ended up with a universe that had any chance of being interesting. And we landed in that very universe. Sir Martin Rees boils this down to sort of 6 dimensionless constants that pretty much had to be in the precise place they are, or particles would have just been flying around with not much else. To talk about the Big Bang might have been followed by a big crunch. Nothing you could imagine of any kind of life, not just our kind, but any kind of complexity could have been possible. Now, of course, the retreat from that is the multiverse, and that requires a certain amount of faith because it seems unlikely that we'll have strong evidence for that. For me, the Occam's razor version of this draws me more comfortably to the idea there's a creator God who's an incredible mathematical physicist and also had an intention of creating a universe that would be interesting and would give rise to thinking creatures with whom God could have a relationship like us. Now that gets you, that gets you to deism. That doesn't get you to theism. We can go there in a minute, but I don't know if you want to break it up into those various chapters.
Yeah, absolutely. And Phil, I really want to give you a chance to respond to the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, because I know you've got some things to say about that. But we have got about a minute before we need to go to the break. So I think we'll possibly best to wait until we've gone to the break and then we'll give you time. But just to say, please don't go anywhere because we will be back after the break. And please let us know if you want to hear anything more from Phil and Francis. Drop us a line, unbelievable@premier.org.uk. But don't go anywhere because we'll be back very shortly.
I really don't think that AI as it is now is on a trajectory to becoming conscious, but it will certainly seem as though machines have conscious minds, and that's a danger.
If consciousness is a property of the brain, then it's subject to what we call causal determinism, physical determinism.
This idea of libertarian free will, I think, is entirely wrong, and I also think is unnecessary.
These systems will become more and more like us. People will treat them and want them to be treated as though they're human. The challenge now is it seems to be going faster and faster.
We are terrible at projecting out long-term consequences.
Robot rights. I can see it coming.
Well, welcome back to The Unbelievable Show. I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by Dr. Francis Collins and Phil Halper. Now, Phil, you have touched on this on other Unbelievable shows, but why don't you think the cosmological or fine-tuning arguments, or perhaps any other, the ones sort of within that sphere, necessarily point to God? I know they're huge topics, and I'm asking you to whittle them down into a really short amount of time, but give us some of your top points, Phil.
Okay, so very briefly, I should say, if you go on my channel, Phil Halper, we have quite detailed videos about this. So if you want more detail, go there.
And I'll make sure there's links to your show as well, Phil, on our links.
Thank you. So very briefly, the idea that the Big Bang is the beginning of time is an outdated view. It was based off of theorems proven by Penrose and Hawking in the mid-1960s. Those theorems have assumptions. One assumption has been shown to be incorrect. That's gravity is always attractive. In 1998, we discovered the universe was accelerating in its expansion, and that is a repulsive form of gravity. So it actually violates these theorems that linked, if you like, the Big Bang to the beginning of time. But on top of that, even if you put that to one side, almost everyone in cosmology would agree that another assumption of these theorems is that general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravity, describes the universe's evolution all the way back to the earliest times when we need quantum mechanics and we need to meld them together. Now, what has happened in the last 20 years is that people have developed quantum theories of gravity, like string theory, like loop quantum gravity, asymptotically safe gravity, all kinds of ideas. And they all seem to be saying, actually, well, it's a common theme, shall we say, that the Big Bang wasn't the beginning in these scenarios. Now, these are speculative ideas. I don't want to say they are correct, but they give us enough pause for thought that we cannot really say that the Big Bang was the beginning at all. In terms of causality, the argument is, how could it be that God doesn't need a cause, but the universe does? That seems inconsistent. And one way to get around that is to say, well, God is outside of time. I think that's what Francis says. So basically, God is timeless, sat before the universe, and then he enters into time. And so God doesn't need it. He's eternal without actually, he doesn't have a beginning without actually being eternal into the past. It's not like God existed for an infinite number of years, but that he existed timelessly. And so therefore he doesn't have a beginning. The problem is there are models of the universe where the universe has exactly the same properties. So the Hartle-Hawking model, time disappears. So you could make the same argument. The universe doesn't need a cause because it is also beginningless, even though it might not be eternal into the past. So basically the same principles arise. There's modern ideas that space-time is an emergent property. So the universe effectively would become sort of outside of space and time in some sense, because space and time would be emergent properties. Now, for the fine-tuning argument, I think it's just wrong to say that we have to choose between a God and a multiverse. In fact, if you survey philosophers, the majority pick neither. There was a very large survey called the Phil Halper survey, and more popular than God or the multiverse was that there is no fine-tuning, that this is a pseudo problem. Another popular idea was that the constants are just brute facts, that they require no further explanation. And actually, I can reveal that my co-author and I have done a survey of physicists, because that was a survey of philosophers. And the most popular view was that there is no fine-tuning. Now, you might say, how can that be? We can unpack that if you want, but you can watch my videos on it to go into more detail. But I want to run another counter that I think, Francis, I'd love to hear your opinion on this, because there's another solution other than there is no fine-tuning or the brute facts, or the multiverse. But there's another solution which is called cosmological natural selection, where you basically take Darwinian principles and apply them to the universe. Because ultimately, I think Francis even says this in his books, that we look at the problem of the genes. How can we have something? If you just randomly threw it all together, you're not going to get a functional organism. So the answer is not that there was a designer, but rather the process that led to our genome was not a purely random process. Darwinism is not purely random. It has a random component, yes, mutation, but it has a non-random component, which is selection. Now, why couldn't the universe have done exactly the same? And in fact, Lee Smolin has come up with a very specific scheme called cosmological natural selection, where black holes give birth to baby universes that inherit the constants, but with a slight variation. And then they're selected for because more stars, which gives you life, would also give you more black holes. So there's a sort of selection pressure. And And what I find compelling about this is that it's actually been linked to some quantum gravity theories that seem to realize some of the details of this. So there's a theory called causal set theory, which actually predicted the value, the small value of the cosmological constant or dark energy, but 10 years before it was discovered. So I find this not necessarily correct. It's still speculative, but it's at least a plausible idea, different to what we literally think of the multiverse, because the multiverse, you have what's called anthropic selection, i.e. there's so many outcomes, one of them is bound to be life permitting, but it's not necessarily typical. Whereas here we have a Darwinian selection principle, quite different. And I'd love to hear what you think of this, Francis.
I had not heard that particular model. I have to read what Lee Smolin is writing about it. I have to understand then how our universe would somehow have been selected for, because I'm not sure the fact that we have life on this little blue planet somewhere in the middle of the great swath of emptiness would allow this universe to somehow be more special than all the other ones that might have gone on for a long time and had stars and stuff, but wouldn't have given rise to this kind of complex life. Yeah, I'd have to understand that better. It does all sound pretty speculative.
It is speculative.
Tempted to come back to the Occam's razor when you sort of have these multiple solutions and ask which one is the most straightforward. And I still having a little trouble embracing some of the weirdness, although I recognize that cosmology is all about weirdness.
Well, Francis, I suppose one of the things to say is that you don't just believe in God because of philosophical or scientific arguments, do you? I mean, you lay that out in both of your books. But that's an important point to raise here, isn't it? And you even said that some of those arguments will perhaps get you to deism, but not to theism. So would you just say a bit about, perhaps we don't need to go into the details, but what are some of those other pointers that you see as a factor to pointing you to God?
The most compelling one for me remains the moral law. Where does morality come from? You can survey all human cultures down through history where we have evidence, and they're kind of cataloged in that wonderful appendix to C.S. Lewis's book called The Abolition of Man. And it's really hard to find any indication that moral law was neglected or ignored by any collection of humans. They all agreed that there was something that was called good and there was something that was called evil. They could agree on that, but they could disagree profoundly about what actions to put in each category. And that is very heavily influenced by culture and societal rules. That's okay. But they never said, oh, there's no need to think about good and evil. We're just going to do anything because it's all the same. That's intriguing. That is, and it is, some of that is visible in animals, but in humans, it seems to have reached a particularly strong point. The evolutionary sociobiologists will try to argue that that comes about because that sense of morality has somehow helped us survive. It's allowed us to be generous with our kinfolk who share our DNA. So that's good because their successful reproduction is basically a good thing for us. It allows us, in some instances, to have even groups that work well together, even if they're not closely related, because it's going to improve their ability to survive. So being nice to your neighbor is not a thing that you could imagine wouldn't be somehow a benefit. But where it falls apart for me is some of the most dramatic places where we humans look at human behavior and make a judgment about morality. Maybe the most dramatic is sort of the radical act of altruism, where somebody puts their own life at risk to try to save somebody they don't even know. The Oskar Schindler example, for instance, where it somehow is possible for a human being to neglect their own even survival, which means neglecting passing on their DNA to try to help other people from another tribe who should have been a threat to them, which is what sociobiology would have said was the appropriate response. This is kind of a scandal to evolution, and it calls out for some kind of reflection on what that is. Furthermore, if I talk to a really strict atheist, and Phil, I don't think you're in that category, but if I go to somebody who says, I know there is no God, and try to get them to tell me then why do they believe in any kind of moral actions, I get a very fuzzy answer. Because if this is all just driven by evolution, then it's a hoax. We're just being hoodwinked into believing that morality matters. And now that we're so smart, we should basically ignore it and kind of go around and do whatever selfish things we want and not feel guilty anymore. But none of them say that. They say, my atheism is driving me to try to do good for the world so other people are not in bondage to faith. Where did you get the idea there's something called good? I don't have a good answer to that. So that was a really strong pointer as I was on my journey to try to decide whether I believed in God, to say, this God sounds to me, if this is the source, and that made a lot of sense, as a force that cares about me and my behavior. And oh boy, I guess I'm in trouble, because if God is aware of my behavior, then he's also aware that I'm falling way short. So that was a really strong signpost. The other one we could also talk about was beauty. I don't have a really good explanation for some things that transport me out of myself on the basis of beauty. And for me, it's often music. Other than it feels like an aching longing for something that's just outside of my grasp, that I'm made for something other than what I'm doing on a daily basis. And this is a little glimpse of it. Another signpost, maybe, to what God is all about. Feels like that might be the case.
Thank you. Phil, I would really love to know what you think as well about this. Francis isn't the only person that says this, but that sense in which lots of scientists who are Christians talk about the fact that there are fundamental questions that science is not actually capable of answering. So just as an example, he lists a few questions in his book, The Road to Wisdom, one of which is, why am I here? What's the meaning of life? Where do I turn when everything seems to be coming apart around me? So how would you respond to that from your atheistic worldview? Why are we here?
Sure. Well, let me just preface it first by saying I really like The Road to Wisdom. It's a great book, and I agree with almost everything in it, apart from the faith bits. So, there's a lot of common ground between us. I also want to quickly come back about the cosmological natural selection thing being too speculative. When the competition is an immaterial mind made the universe out of nothing, I don't think we have to worry about this as too speculative. So we have to compare theories. But anyway, coming on to morality, this is a very difficult question. I agree. I don't think science can answer this question. I think we turn to philosophy to answer moral questions. But what we can do is, like a detective, we can rule out certain suspects. And what I think we can do, in order to run the moral argument at all, I think you have to trust your moral intuitions. Because if you don't trust those, then you can't really say anything's wrong, right? How do I know rape is wrong? Well, my moral intuitions tell me that. So if I can trust my moral intuitions, then I can also say the biblical God is not moral, because the biblical God wiped out all living things on earth in a flood. All the animals for man's sin. That's not moral. He commanded the slaughter of the Amalekites, not just the men and the women and the children, but also their animals. And we can go on, case after case after case of immoral things that the biblical God does. All right, actually, one more. The story of Achan, where you have someone basically takes something from the conquered peoples, and God's not happy with that. He thinks it's impure. So basically, Achan is killed, stoned to death. But not just him, but his possessions. His possessions are his women, his wife, his children, and his animals. This is not a moral God. So wherever morality comes from, I have to say I don't know, but I can rule out the biblical God. It can't be from that God. So that we can cross off the list. Now, can evolution explain morality? I think it can. We have different ideas about how evolution might explain morality. I'm sympathetic to the ideas that maybe there's an evolutionary drive to just generate a sense of empathy, and evolution will create, it always has variations, right? It's never one thing. So maybe in some people that sense of empathy is really, really strong, and other people's is really, really weak. That would explain why there are psychopaths. That would explain why there's people who, yes, kill themselves to save other people. Maybe there's something in evolution that drives the sense of empathy. And another idea I'm sympathetic to is like a game theory approach to morality, where just like when you play a game, you learn better strategies. So the chess players of today, the grandmasters of today, they would destroy the grandmasters of yesterday, not because they're naturally better or smarter, but we've just learned better strategies. So similarly with morality, we've learned better strategies of how to sort of play the game of life. And that would explain why morality seems to change over time. I think that there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. That wasn't the case, 100 years ago. People thought it was immoral. If we look at the Bible, it seems to say it's immoral. So that doesn't look like the right source of morality. So we can learn. And if you think that God's given us morality, then you have to answer, why has morality changed so much over time? And also, how do you make it consistent with the Bible? Because in the Bible, it seems that the original sin was for human beings to take morality, and God didn't like that. They ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they became like gods. That was a sin. So it doesn't seem consistent to me. I mean, you'll have a different interpretation of the Bible. I'm sure I'd love to hear your view on this, but it seems that God didn't want us to have morality.
Francis, do respond to Phil, and then I'm very keen to get into truth, which is a big topic of your book, but do respond to Phil, because like you said, we'd love to hear what you've got to say about that.
So sure, the sin was basically disobeying God. This was sort of a test, and we humans failed. And the consequence of that was losing the opportunity to live eternally on the planet, and also to have this knowledge of good and evil. But having failed to obey God, it was pretty clear how we were going to handle that next opportunity for good and evil, that we would often choose the evil part. I take what you're saying, that morality changes over time. I'm not sure it's always a positive vector. There are times where it takes a negative direction. The entire experience of the more recent times of the wide adoption of slavery in the United States, for instance, over the last 400 years, that was a very unfortunate slip back. There was, of course, slavery in biblical times, but to adopt it in such a widespread way and cruel and harsh way that basically reduced human beings to animals, that was a huge step back. And yet somehow it was like, okay, because it's going to be good for our economics. So we figured out how to move actions from the good column to the bad column and back again based on other considerations. But again, I think the point is, we all still knew there was a column called good and there was a column called evil. And maybe we're all vulnerable to influences about what fits in each column, but we know it's there and we're called to it. And when we basically screw up and do something in the evil column, we make an excuse, don't we? Which only proves that we know the moral law is there and we just broke it, and it must not be our fault.
Francis, let's move on to truth, because that's a big topic that you raise in your book, and particularly in light of everything that you were involved in COVID, and obviously that formed a lot of your book. But this is a huge question. But does truth still matter in a post-truth society?
Yes. And we cannot accept being a post-truth society unless we want to accept continual deterioration of the opportunity to flourish. Post-truth, which is a common term that's thrown around, sort of taking postmodernist even to the next level of denying the existence of objective truth, is, I think, a universally negative cultural philosophical trend that I deeply regret. And no scientist can possibly ascribe to a post-truth perspective. Otherwise, what are you doing anyway? There is such a thing as reality. I'm sorry for the people who think we're all living in a computer simulation. I don't know what to say to them. But let's accept the evidence from our senses that there is such a thing as reality. And what is truth? Truth is the ability to describe accurately features of that reality that correspond to it. That's the correspondence theory of truth. And it's rather sensible and in many ways obvious description of something we should really care about. The earth really does go around the sun. The earth is really not flat, except there are thousands of people who belong to the flat earth society who are denying that for whatever reason. But that's not a good thing. That is basically a direction we don't want to go. And yet society seems to be going there more and more, especially as we've gotten into our particular tribal alliances. And it's become acceptable if there's a fact you don't like to say, well, I don't believe that. Mm. Facts don't care how you feel. That's part of truth. Truth has no interest in your personal feelings about the consequences of that fact. It just is. And as a society, I think we've slipped rather badly in that regard. And we can talk about climate change as perhaps a very dramatic example, which was mentioned earlier, that people don't want to think of that as happening. So, okay, then I don't have to believe it. Or I can say, well, there's still people who disagree and the jury's still open. No, it's not. The thermometer is not a political instrument. Our planet is on an unprecedented curve of warming since about 1950 that places us at serious difficulty in the coming years that we have not yet got our heads around. That's truth. You can't just sort of put that aside because you don't like it. Now, in the book, I do try to argue that there are these various levels, and a lot of the confusion is that we forgot which kind of a statement is being discussed. At the most fundamental level are things that would be true in any universe, and most of those are mathematics, like 2 + 2 is going to be 4. Even if God decided to make it 5, even God could not do that. But then that next level is established facts, that we as a society, this is our epistemology. This is how we've acquired knowledge. This is how we've basically concluded those things are true. Now, occasionally we need to modify them. Newton's laws needed some further elaboration when quantum came along, but Newton's laws still work really well in most everyday experiences. And to basically lift something out of that zone of an established fact because you don't like it, that's a really dangerous action to do. And then there's this next level of uncertainty where we have some evidence one way, some evidence the other way. That's fine. If we want to have an argument there, that's enriching. That's the way it should be. But over time, our goal is to track those uncertain things and move them into established facts. Maybe we will figure out what dark matter is. I would love to have that one sorted. Maybe Phil can help me there. And then you go a little further out and you get to just opinion. Like, are dogs or cats better pets? Sorry, cat sitting next to me. There's some people who don't agree with that conclusion that says dogs are better. Or it's about fashion. Do men look good in shoes that have brown leather tops and thick white soles? There's a disagreement at my house about that. And that's fine. That doesn't threaten the scheme of things. But the trouble is when those different levels get all blurred out, and one person may say, well, because my opinion is true, you have to accept it. Sorry, if it's an opinion, that's not going to fly. And somebody else says, well, I don't believe any of it, including the established facts, because I don't like those. And we are in a post-truth society, so I get to decide what my truth is. That does not work. That is the road to anarchy, to chaos, to a society that none of us will love.
Well, Phil, I would love to hear your response to that. And I assume you agree with loads of that. But again, I'm so sorry we keep doing this. We're going to have to go to a quick break. But please don't go anywhere. And if you're enjoying the show, please do consider rating it and giving us a review on your preferred podcast platform so that more people can find it.
I recently saw Richard Dawkins. Sort of embarrassingly, I sort of said I was actually at Evensong last night. And he said, me too.
It's not as if I ever looked at a supermarket shelf of religions and said, I think I'll have that one. I found this continued to unfold and make the best sense I could imagine.
The person of Jesus compels me. Is life all suffering? Is it all love? No, it's both. It's both. And in this story, they are held in this. I find it beautiful.
The way I think of Christianity is that in the person of Jesus, God and us and the universe came together in a unique and unparalleled way.
You're supposed to be atheists. Christians.
This has all happened since you invited me, sorry. Sorry.
Don't worry, I haven't become an atheist.
There's now one atheist on the panel.
I've got some bad news.
welcome back to the final part of Unbelievable with Dr. Francis Collins and Phil Halper. Phil, just before the break, we were talking about truth and the need for truth in a post-truth society. I mean, do you think that science is the only way to discover truth, or are there other ways that you would say we can discover truth? And what are some of those ways, in your opinion, Phil?
Well, science is not the only way to truth. Absolutely not. Science answers scientific questions. Moral philosophy does moral questions. Mathematics does mathematical questions. Art critics do those questions. But we need to focus, I think, on the disaster unfolding in front of us right now. Because, and I hate to get political, but I think we need to, because Donald Trump has just been elected president of the United States. And let's put this in a real perspective here. This is a president that does not believe in climate change, that has just appointed as his health ministers people like RFK, who, doesn't believe that HIV causes AIDS, that says he's not anti-vaccine, but opposes sort of every vaccine that I've ever heard him comment on. He's just made Dr. Oz in his cabinet. This is someone that falls for all kinds of crackpot, pseudoscience. This is an incredible disaster unfolding in front of our eyes. And there's actually an analogy. It's funny because we included it in an original draft of our book and then it got cut, but it's in Francis's book. So I want to sort of mention it. And that is when the space shuttle Challenger took off in 1986, it exploded. And the reason turned out to be because they ignored the warnings of the experts. The expert says, don't launch in these cold temperatures. And they basically ignored them. And Richard Feynman, who was a Nobel Prize winning physicist, investigated it. And he basically said something like, reality, nature cannot be fooled. You have to accept reality. This phrase, nature cannot be fooled, is very, very important. Because when you start doing things for political purposes, like ignoring climate change or telling people they don't need to wear masks. I mean, actually, Trump, just by not wearing a mask, signaled to all his followers, and this is in Francis's book, signaled to all his followers they don't need to wear masks, or maybe they shouldn't wear masks. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of people died. People should be really angry about this. Nature doesn't care about your politics. It will hit you if you ignore it. And that's why science is so important, because it tells us about nature. And it tells us that, yes, vaccines are safe and they're effective. Masks are a great way to stop the spread of disease. And when people, for political reasons, just ignore the truth, disasters happen. Space shuttles explode, people die. This is going to be what confronts us in the future.
So, Francis, with all of that in mind, bearing in mind that these are such huge topics that involve so many people, how should we be weighing up truth claims and how we should be discerning truth from fiction?
Well, that comes down to the issue of trust. Who do you trust? What institutions? What individuals? That seems to me like a serious part of the malaise that has happened now, where we've lost, many of us, the ability to figure out how to size up various claims and decide which of those to take on board in our own store of knowledge. I think trust, when it's done right, depends on 4 characteristics of the source that we should be thinking about. Does the source have integrity? Is this something that you can look at the history of that particular individual or that institution? Have they behaved in a way that reflects honesty, sticking to some kind of a moral compass, or are they all over the place? Secondly, and maybe the obvious one, competence. Do they know what they're talking about? Have they done the work? Are they truly an expert or just claiming to be one for that particular post on Facebook? Competence is not easy to come by. And unfortunately, in a lot of conversations right now in the US, being competent is called being an elitist. That's a really dangerous. There's a whole book called The Death of Expertise, which is quite searing in terms of the way in which society has begun to take that attitude. But come on, people, if you want to be given information that you can trust, it ought to come from somebody who's done the work. The third one, which took me a little while to realize, but I think I see it all the time, is humility. Does that source not just have expertise in a particular area, but also recognizes their limitations in that area, that they're willing to say, here's what I know, and also here's what I don't know. and who isn't about to give you recommendations in an area they aren't an expert on. Celebrities violate that rule all the time and have enormous followings who somehow think that they have special knowledge about things like diet, which is completely bogus. And we ought to be really wary of that. So those three kind of make sense: integrity, competence, humility. But then there's this fourth one, which has gotten out of control, and it is shared values. Does this person live in my bubble, or at least agree with the main principles in my bubble, which are generally these days political? Does this person have the same attitude about things they're fearful and angry about? If those are positive reasons to accept somebody's information, then that should be a warning sign in a big way. But that's happening a lot. And the contrary side of that is if the source is in some other bubble that you currently consider to be misguided or maybe even stupid and evil, you're going to ignore that information, although that might be exactly the message that you need to hear and is full of integrity and competence and humility. You're going to go, no, not from those people. We're making that mistake all the time, and we're allowing our own personal fund of knowledge to be contaminated by information that gets smuggled in and be basically defeated in its effort to grab onto things that could be much more valuable for our own flourishing. That's a fundamental place where we've gone wrong. It all, of course, comes back to the polarization, the divisiveness, the unwillingness to think of people who don't agree with us as worth talking to. We have to turn that around.
Phil, I'm well aware that this may well go into the area of philosophy, and neither of you are philosophers, so I just want to make that clear. But do you think, Phil, that there is such a thing as absolute truth? And if so, where do we get the grounding for that?
Well, it depends what you mean exactly. But I think generally I'm going to agree with Francis that there are real facts about the world. You know, the Earth goes around the sun, not the other way around. You can't just decide that's not the case. So there are, I think, objective facts in the world. And what grounds them is, the question is, how do we know them? I think is more important. And I think that science can reveal those facts by experimentation, by deduction. Now, of course, there are other more nebulous things. Are there moral facts? We have to do philosophy for that. And that's not an easy question. So, yes, I think truth exists. And I think science can uncover truth. It's not the only way to truth. But there is, a real problem today that I think it's not necessarily people don't believe in truth. I mean, I think the people that deny climate change, that deny evolution, that deny that vaccines can save your life, they're not saying, I don't believe in truth. What they are saying is, well, I just, trust this source rather than that source. And I think Francis has got it exactly right, that, there's many things that will indicate to you who are the trustworthy sources, the integrity, the competence, and so on and so forth. And what's happened today is, there are many factors that have led people to go away from, what is solid information about what is true. And there are many reasons for that. It's the rise of social media, rise of political news stations like Fox News. However, I do want to come back to the fact that I think that evangelical Christianity is one of the reasons. It's not the only reason. But if you tell people that the Bible is all true, and experts say no, it isn't. The world wasn't made in the way that Genesis says. Not just that, there wasn't a global flood. I was reading a book on biblical archaeology, and the consensus of Egyptologists is that the Exodus never happened. That's a foundational moment in the story of Judaism. It's not surprising then that some of those people will reject the views of experts. Again, it's not the only reason. There are many other things, political motivations, maybe just individualism, political ideology will cause you to reject climate science. So religion is not the only cause, but I think a certain type of religion is one of the causes. And, that's a real problem.
Well, Francis, let's pick up on that, because I think Phil raises some really important questions there. I mean, is Christianity part of the problem or the solution when it comes to the decline of truth and the trust in experts? What should we do about that?
Yes. No, it's a good question. I think it's clear that Christians over many decades have had an uncomfortable relationship with science. And you've already cited a lot of the reasons for that, and particularly evolution, going back to when Darwin first published The Origin of Species, and certainly then in the United States highlighted just about 100 years ago in the Scopes trial, where basically evolution was on trial. It was a circus. It made people who considered themselves to be Bible-believing Christians feel like they got a huge put down. They were made to look like backward, stupid people. And they kind of withdrew for a while, but remained still in that sense of having been injured by a secular attack, which was really unfortunate and carries over even now, 100 years later. But I do think while Christians are in a position perhaps of particular difficulty here in accepting everything that science says, it is possible to do so. I'm an example of that. The couple of million people who are regularly visiting BioLogos are great examples of that. This is a solvable problem. The wonderful books that John Walton has written about Genesis, the lost world of Genesis 1 and the lost world of Genesis 2 and the lost world of the flood, those are very worth reading. Heck, go back and read Augustine at 400 AD. If you need a lesson in hermeneutics, which is how to read some of the Old Testament books without trying to turn them into literal scientific descriptions or even literal historical descriptions, try to put yourself in the mind of someone who is reading that for the first time. There's so much we layer on top of those readings from our own current culture that just doesn't fit. So those are ways to kind of get past this. But I also want to say, I think Christians particularly, but other people of faith as well, are maybe in the best place here to offer solutions to all of this divisiveness. Read the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, the clearest description of Jesus calling to us about how we are supposed to live our lives. There's so much in there. And of course, it's all about the Beatitudes, the blessed of the meek, the peacemakers. Blessed are you if you are persecuted. All of those things are the opposite of the way most Christians are currently behaving. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say most, the way some visible Christians are behaving.
We're all friends here, it's fine.
But it's also, you are called to love your neighbor, and even, which must have been a scandal when Jesus said it, love your enemies. If we could bring the center of the faith back to that and screen out all of the politics that's overtaken those foundations in totally negative ways, then I think Christians could be in a great place to be part of our healing. And God knows we need a healing.
Thank you, Francis. I mean, one of the areas that you touch on in your book where truth and trust are clearly at, well, the danger of stake, I think you put it as you say, there's unprecedented potential here for mischief, is artificial intelligence. Phil, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts about how we should approach AI in light of the fact that there clearly is the danger of fake news and how do we check it? And, you know, you write something in ChatGPT and then Francis has an example where he asks for references and it either gives totally false references or there are no references. How do we deal with that, Phil? Because that's clearly where we're going in the future, isn't it?
Right. So I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Sean Carroll, but I can't remember. Somebody said, I'm much more afraid of human stupidity than I am of artificial intelligence. So to me, that's the biggest worry. Like mass extinctions, rise of new diseases, antibiotic resistance, climate change. These to me are much bigger worries than artificial intelligence. With new technologies, you never know when they're going to plateau. So, of course, we have a very steep rise in the abilities of artificial intelligence, very impressive capabilities of ChatGPT and Google Gemini. And yes, I've also found looking up references and then I'm like, oh, great, it's giving me the reference. Oh, let's just check it. Oh, that was totally made up. So yes, I've experienced that. And so there's a danger there. Of course, it can be a good source of knowledge. I have found it useful. So it's too early to say whether this is going to be a net benefit or a net negative, and also too early to say how far it's going to go. I mean, people think that it's going to just continually increase, but I'd like to point out, other technologies had very rapid growth and then just stopped. So take aviation, for example. 1903, first airplane flight. 1947, the first supersonic jet flight. So people thought, oh my God, it won't be long before we have hypersonic jets and we'll be flying to Sydney in 90 minutes. Never happened. We got to that point, supersonic flight, and we stopped. It did not continue to increase. And in fact, current airlines of today are not as fast as what we had in the past. We used to have Concorde and now we don't. Another example, room temperature superconductivity in the 1980s. Everyone was so excited that we could get better and better superconductivity at higher and higher temperatures. It'd only be a matter of time before we have room temperature superconductors, and that will revolutionize society. And then the progress just stopped. So who knows what will happen with AI? But our biggest problem is not artificial intelligence, it's human stupidity.
Francis, ethics clearly comes into this when we're talking not just about AI, but I guess when we're talking about the future of science. Obviously, your area of expertise, genetics and veering into genetic modification. How do we ground those ethics? Because it can't be science alone. There needs to be ethics sort of grounding some of these groundbreaking scientific discoveries, doesn't there?
Absolutely. One of the things I was proudest of as the Human Genome Project was getting off the ground was putting in place an ethical, legal, and social implications program, so-called ELSI, which had never really been done quite like that. We didn't have a crisis at the beginning. We wanted to be sure we were thinking about what the dilemmas might be that this would produce if it succeeded. And out of that came some very deep scholarship and ultimately a legislative initiative, which took 12 years and finally happened, that said you can't have your DNA used against you in your health coverage or in your employment. That's just wrong. You don't get to pick your DNA. It should not be a source of discrimination. That was hard fought. And I don't think it would have happened if we hadn't started early to work on that and build momentum behind it. Right now, things in biotechnology that come to mind. By the way, I would say most of the time when you get a bunch of bioethicists together, and maybe some of them are people of faith and most of them are not, they generally agree on the sort of idea of how you fit together those main principles of autonomy and benevolence and non-maleficence and justice. Why? Well, because those come out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and even the secular ethicists have kind of adopted them as well because they seem right. But occasionally, from a Christian perspective, you may have a bit more of a sense that there's something here that we really ought to think about, whether it's something we want to do. An example right now is, do we really want to start using gene editing on human embryos to change the very nature of our own instruction book, just not for that individual, but for their offspring, really reinventing what it means to be human? I am very troubled about that, and not just on the basis of safety questions, which are still serious, but also on the basis of really, what does it mean to be human? Psalm 139, if we're fearfully and wonderfully made, are we about to remake ourselves? Is that really what we're called to do as children of God? I'm very uneasy about crossing that line. Secular ethicists seem increasingly comfortable saying, well, let's think about that.
I guess, as you say, there's a fine line, isn't there, between treatment and enhancement, and where do you draw on that line and how do you do it? But Phil, where do you think we get our ethics from? Because for Francis, there's, I suppose, an obvious grounding for his ethics. For you, is it a number of different places where you'd get your ethics from for big questions like this about scientific future?
Yeah, I mean, well, as I said, one place we definitely don't get our ethics from is from the biblical God, because the biblical God is not ethical. But where do we get them from? I think you have to ground them somewhere, right? So like in mathematics, you start with an axioms and then you work out what is deduced from the axioms. You can't always prove the axioms. You have to start with what you think is the most evidently true. And I think you ground morality and ethical questions in the fact that something that I think we can all know just purely through introspection, that suffering is bad, that pain is bad. And so we try and minimize suffering. And from that, we could try and deduce things. So, for example, I deduce that we should allow gay people to marry, because if we didn't, they would feel unnecessarily suffering because they can't fulfill their love. I think that we shouldn't be eating animals because that causes unnecessary suffering. So I try and deduce things from these basic axioms. But like mathematics, you can't necessarily prove the axioms. You have to just go with what you think is the least controversial statement that you can make, something that's the most self-evidently true, even though, of course, maybe you can't prove all the axioms, just like in mathematics.
I'm aware that we are really running out of time and there's so much to cover. But one thing I'd really love to ask you about, Francis, while I've got you here, one of the things that we're talking about quite a lot in the UK at the moment is assisted dying. It's sort of going through that Parliament at the moment where people are discussing it. And I know assisted suicide is already legal in various states in the US. So I just wondered, while we had you, is there anything that you would want to say to a country who's considering whether to start down this path?
Well, I'm not an expert in the way in which those ethical debates have played out, both amongst people of faith and people who are coming at it from a secular perspective. I do think it's an incredibly important and sensitive area. I can certainly see the experience that of somebody who is suffering excruciating pain from far advanced cancer for which there is no hope of recovery, for whom the idea of being released from this seems supportable for anyone who has compassion. It all comes down to just how much do you blur from that circumstance into one that troubles me more, and that's certainly happening in Canada and some states in the US, where individuals are now making that choice in a circumstance that seemed like it might have had some reversibility possibilities, even from, for instance, mental health suffering. So think really hard, UK, about how you want to work out where you think the appropriate and inappropriate applications might be. Everybody will disagree, but it's a really important thing to try to come with some kind of majority view.
Phil, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts about this, but feel free to respond.
Yeah. One thing, I am sympathetic to assisted dying, but one thing I might point out to those that aren't is a lot of people think it's okay to put their pets down when they are at the end of their lives and they're suffering. It seems completely inconsistent to say, well, it's okay to put the pets down, but not the humans. I mean, the humans can give consent, but the pets can't. So it seems to me the case for euthanasia in humans is stronger than it is for pets. So that's something that people should think about. But ultimately, I think we do have to be very careful to make sure that if we do go ahead with assisted dying, it has to be done very, very, very cautiously, that it shouldn't be done willy-nilly and, only in particular cases. But ultimately, if people want to do that and they want to end their lives painlessly, I don't see any particular reason why they shouldn't. And people do need to consider the inconsistency with their pets as well.
Francis, one of the things you speak brilliantly about is how we listen better to people with very opposing opinions. And I know you're both brilliant at this. But do you have any thoughts on how we can get better at that, Francis, looking forwards?
Yeah, practice helps. I'm part of a group called Braver Angels that has more than 100 chapters across the US. And it's all about learning to listen to somebody with a different perspective and not just immediately get your back up and start to tell them while they're wrong, which is unfortunately what happens otherwise. So this means listening to understand so well that you can speak back to them what you heard them say, and they will say, yes, that's what I said. Of course, this is a therapy trick that is used in marriage therapy. Our world needs marriage therapy between the warring parties, and we won't get there unless we commit to recognizing that people who don't agree with us are still lovable, are still people who are good and honorable. And we just need to invest in understanding where they're coming from and how they've arrived at a particular perspective. You need to get better at asking the question, so what part of your experience has led you to that conclusion? And then really hear the answer. I learned an awful lot about that. I learned about how some of the public health measures that we instituted in the U.S. really seemed very ham-handed for people in the heartland, where the experience of the pandemic was totally different. And we should have done a better job of listening at the time. And now we got to listen and figure out how to do it differently the next time.
Phil, any final thoughts from you? What is the road to wisdom? How do we learn to listen better to those who have completely opposing opinions to us?
Well, I totally agree with Francis. Practice it really helps. So I've been involved in groups like the Unbelievable Meetup group, where we have atheists and Christians discussions. And from that, I also joined another group called Socratic Society in Oxford University, where we not only do we debate, and it's quite vigorous, but then we go to the pub and we enjoy each other's company. We're not all debating. Sometimes we might just talk about what do you think of Barbie and Oppenheimer, and So I think yes,
all the important things.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. So the important thing is not to demonize your opponent. But I shouldn't even say opponent. Your interlocutor. They're people. So I think that's very important. And keep an open mind and listen. Absolutely. But of course, the biggest problems won't be solved by purely listening. We do need to respect truth and evidence, because we have these great crises, a climate crisis. We have, potential mass extinction event going on. There's been a rise in new viruses over time, antibiotic resistance. These have to be solved by accepting truth and the truth that's revealed to us by science, and the appropriate solutions from that. And listening will help. It will help bridge our society together. But it is not enough.
Phil, Francis, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you,
Ruth. It's been a real pleasure. Phil, great to be on this program with you. This was a fun conversation.
And thank you for joining us. I'll make sure that there's links to Phil's YouTube channel and Francis's books and everything else that you might want to know about them. As ever, we would love to know what you think. Please do connect with us on social media at Premier Unbelievable. And don't forget to give us a quick review on your podcast platform if you are enjoying the show. Thank you so much for joining us on Unbelievable, and see you next time.